But what I can do is control who I am, how I show up. My experience has been when I've been in 2 CEO roles that doing that without expectation and attachment to others following me has been incredibly powerful. Many people follow that example. Many people get inspired. The word inspire comes from the Latin word to breathe air into, breathe life into. Many people get, life and air breathed into them by that example. Some don't. That's always going to be the case. And so people will know the difference, even subconsciously, between a leader who is genuinely embodying a set of values and ways of being because he or she thinks that's the right thing to do for an organization, and one that's doing it for some result so that others change.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Darren Gold, who's going to share how to master our code and reprogram ourselves to be extraordinary. And who doesn't want to be extraordinary? Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. Today's quote is from Carl Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. We're going to dig into that today with our guest, who's going to share how we can change that. Before we do, I want to share something from a book I recently read, Generation Z Unfiltered. This research, plus a study done at Yale University more recently, reveals conclusions that should inform us how we lead and mentor students today. For the most part, youth exposed to adversity while growing up actually become stronger for having experienced it. Their emotional muscles grow stronger. Without these stressors, or when adults rescue kids from such stressors, they begin to give up more quickly, believing they need adults around to save them from hardship. Youth are naturally anti-fragile, and it's adults who make them fragile over time. The second point, it is only when the stressors become toxic and chronic, continue for years, that children begin to surrender their will and stop trying. When they're thrust over and over again into stress-inducing situations during childhood or adolescence, our psychological stress response shifts into overdrive, and we lose the ability to respond appropriately and effectively to future stressors 10, 20, even 30 years later. Here's the bottom line. Kids need to be stressed. They also need hope. We're going to dig into that a bit today in our episode as you hear Darren's story and the resulting issues much later in life. It's something we need to be more aware of. Kids become more anxious and struggle when they have not learned how to deal with life. The current helicopter and lawnmower parenting styles are doing far more harm to kids than helping them. If you have kids or grandkids, the book is a good read to help you better understand what the next generation is feeling. Let's review last week's action step. What was something that makes you uncomfortable? That's where we grow. Did you step into that discomfort? For me, public speaking, even though I'm on this microphone in front of a crowd, makes me uncomfortable. That's why I go to Toastmasters. I get over that discomfort, and I'm getting better, and I keep winning ribbons. Today's guest is Darren Gold. He is a managing partner at the Triumph Group, where he advises and coaches CEOs and leadership teams at many of the world's most innovative companies, including Roche, Dropbox, Lululemon, Sephora, Cisco, eBay, Activision, and Warner Brothers. He is the author of a new book, Master Your Code: The Art, Wisdom, and Science of Leading an Extraordinary Life. Let's meet our guest. Welcome to Richer Soul, Darren Gold. It's great to have you join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rocky. Thanks for the opportunity.
And I read the book, and I'm excited to have the conversation based on what I read.
Oh, I'm excited too.
So let's start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Oh boy, that is a big question because there's a lot to share. I'll be brief. I grew up for those of your listeners who get the book and read the book, in a pretty volatile environment. My father was was in London, England. I didn't move to the States until I was 7 years old when I first moved to the States. And he was a World War II baby, but took to the streets very early, dropped out of school when he was 14. So he was a hustler. And so I remember very vividly, my dad would take me to what he called the markets, which is the kind of the U.S. equivalent of the swap meet, where he sold a lot of goods. And I later learned in life, most of those goods were not legitimately acquired. But we would go there and I'd spend, most of the day with my dad on a weekend. And I remember very vividly at the end of the day, counting the cash. There's just this incredibly clear picture of the relationship between a hard day of work and the cash at the end of the day, right? It wasn't like a paycheck that came 2 weeks later. It was you either sold stuff or you didn't. And the reward was you had money, and that money was used to put food on the table. And so from a very early age, there was this, I wouldn't say sort of more traditional like connection between hard, legitimate work and money. It was a connection between kind of hustle and the uncertainty of money. And in that uncertainty was born a very strong belief that that has really run me for some time. And now I've spent quite a bit of time, sort of taking control of and shaping for myself, but one that was do anything you can in your power to avoid financial insecurity. And so for much of my life, particularly the first, sort of 25, 30, 35 years, I was driven by an intense desire to never have to feel financially insecure. And it was an almost all-consuming desire and motivation for me. So quite a pretty profound impact for me early on.
And so when you say that created that driving desire to remove uncertainty, what did that look like? What was it that you were actually doing?
So it began with the complete opposite path from my father. I grew up most of my childhood with just my father, and he dropped out of school, was uneducated. I was a boy that was intensely focused on learning everything I could and becoming educated and succeeding in school. So my life was all oriented around academic success, being smart, learning a lot, doing well in school, being recognized, because that was my ticket to a very different life. So the first thing, just sort of as I was growing up, was an intense focus on education. Once I had sort of checked that box and went to a a good university and then graduate school, it then became a path around, what can I do? What's the immediate next step I can take to climb the ladder, the traditional sort of success ladder, and make sure that I was earning as much money as possible along the way. And so, and I know, in your show, you talk a lot about this, this sort of almost mindless, automatic, reactive sort of approach to life, which was, I just need to get to the next hurdle. And when I get to that next hurdle, I need to get to the next one. And so there was a strong urge that I wasn't even aware of at the time, to get ahead by traditional measures because of the importance of how do I provide for myself, for my family. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I was providing for my father. So I got married early, I had children early, I was providing for my father. So in many ways, it was an immense amount of responsibility and I'd say probably self-imposed pressure to make sure I was in a financial position to be a provider. And so that's how it shaped kind of my early part of my life for sure.
So I have a question about uncertainty. We all have to face uncertainty, right? We can never predict the outcome of anything. I mean, we can do our best. How did you become comfortable accepting uncertainty?
Well, part of me didn't, and part of me did. I think the strive for financial security was a reaction to my fear of uncertainty. But part of me actually was very comfortable with it. And I think part of it was, and I talk about this in my book, an identity that I had formed very early in life, subconsciously, and I credit my father with it, which is you'll be the best at everything you do and you can accomplish anything in life. That was a mantra that my father instilled in me. I think mainly, I don't think he knew he was doing it, from a sort of, I'm going to give my son a really good identity. I think it was an identity born out of love and affection. But it was a strong belief system that was instilled in me early that no matter what, if I worked hard, I had the innate ability to make things happen and for good things to happen. And so there was a big part of me that sort of confronted the volatility of my childhood, the uncertainty of forging a path, the first to go to college in my family, that was made a lot easier by a belief system, what I call an identity, that whatever I did was going to work out. And I had this extreme, supreme self-confidence that in many ways really wasn't warranted, but I had it nonetheless. And that's really how I really dealt with the level of uncertainty that I faced.
And I think when I was growing up, it was just kind of that same atmosphere of you can have anything you want in life.
Yeah.
You have that ability. And so I was also ingrained kind of with that message as well. Have you done something different to raise your kids to live an extraordinary life?
Yeah, a lot. And here's what I say about beliefs a lot. I have a strong belief around financial security and the need for achievement and the belief in myself. And I say every single belief is constructed. Most beliefs are designed to keep you safe. And many of them limit you and limit your effectiveness. And so when I look at my own beliefs, and then I look at the sort of beliefs that my children have sort of constructed in response to, my wife and I and our parenting of them, is that there's nothing wrong with the beliefs that you've constructed early on in childhood. The opportunity is to expand those beliefs, not get rid of them. So, as I think about my children, whether I was doing this consciously or not, and I think it was more consciously, it was to give them a more expansive set of beliefs. So it's not that money isn't important or financial security isn't important. It's just that there's more to life than that. And so their degree of action, their freedom to do things, the freedom to be multiplies, right? Where they can hold a both and, like, oh, I can see why financial security is important. And I can see why living your passion, doing what you're meant to do in the world, doing things that really light you up are important. And I can hold both of those beliefs simultaneously is a more expanded worldview, a more expanded set of beliefs. So I think in many ways, it's a really interesting question you're asking. It's been a loosening of the rigidity of beliefs that I held. not a discarding of them, so that my children have them available to serve them when it makes sense, and they have the freedom to think more broadly and to hold more broad beliefs when it doesn't. And I think that's probably the first time I've articulated it that way. Maybe the first time I've been asked that question in the way you asked it. The main difference. So I think in some respects, my hope is they get the benefit of much of my upbringing and childhood without a lot of the downsides of it, and can live a life that has more degrees of freedom and more choice in it.
And we've done the same. I think one of the things I wonder about, and I don't know the truth, is if we don't let them struggle, does that remove the fire in the belly?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think my friends and I talk about that a lot. What if, our kids, have had it too easy, right? They've been sheltered. They've been cocooned. They live in a bubble. They don't know what hard life is. I'm not saying that isn't true, but I don't know if I believe it. I believe that you as a child can appreciate the lessons that one gets through a life of hardship without living a life of hardship. And I haven't, proven that out yet, but two of my three children are now out of the house in college, and I'm watching them as they mature into lovely adults. And I do believe that they, through a not like a hardcore, teaching. Like I have never been a parent that has tried to tell my children like how to live life or what are the lessons you have to be successful, to be fulfilled, to live well. But I think they've appreciated through the more subtle act of parenting, the love that I've given and the role modeling that my wife and I have done, that are lessons to be learned that they may not directly experience, but can really appreciate. And we'll see.
And I'm probably in the same boat as you. My daughter is off to college, and so she is in that process of doing everything on her own. And a lot of the conversations we have are like about a lot of the people who are near her, and they don't know how to live life. I guess that the new term for kids these days is adulting. And she's just amazed at how many people just don't know how to do the basics of life. And I think she's becoming to appreciate what she's been given. And then we give her struggle and saying, you've got to figure out your path, go work at it. And she is, and she's doing well at it. So I think we built the foundation, but it is that constant conversation.
It is.
So we are here today to talk about your book, which I really enjoyed. It's called Master Your Code: The Art, Wisdom, and Science of Leading an Extraordinary Life. Why did you choose to write the book?
I had always, I'm an avid reader, probably read 30 or 40 books a year. And kind of that's that insatiable learning part of my program in full effect. And so, as I've read over the years, I've had this underlying desire, maybe not fully aware of it or fully expressed, to write a book. So there was that. But then about 2.5 years ago, when my oldest son went away to college, I wrote him a letter. And it was a letter that was, even though I said, I'm trying to tell my kids how to live a good life, it was a letter about, hey, you're going to college. Here's my wisdom that I'm offering to you. And I shared it with a handful of friends and clients, senior business leaders, and the reaction was so overwhelming and so positive. People started sharing it. By the time a few months had passed, it had several thousand reads, and without me even trying. So I knew there was something was deeply resonating for people in that letter, and the seeds of the book were contained in that letter. And I used it as the real catalyst for writing the book. I was at a leadership conference, a leadership retreat, a 4-day retreat. And the first thing they asked us was, come up with a commitment that you were really excited about. And it was an embodied leadership course. It was all about declaring and embodying this commitment. And the commitment I landed on in that first day was to write a book. And the commitment was to write the first draft of that book within the first 12 months. And that was the commitment I made back in I don't know what it was, August or September of 2017. And I followed through on that commitment. I used that letter to my son as the original construct for the book. So that was really the inspiration. But really underneath it all was this collected body of wisdom and experience that I had that I just felt I needed to put out into the world. It's part of who I am, what my mission is, what my purpose is in life. And we can get into this if we want, but a lot of things holding me back from writing that book. So there was a process of overcoming my own limiting beliefs about not being an author and not having anything interesting or original to write or not being a good enough writer. I remember my wife telling me, "Are you crazy?" But it just speaks to the power, the insanity of the beliefs that we hold about ourselves. But that's sort of the genesis of the book.
And we will dig into it. Before we do, I just have one last question around the book. I've spoken to a lot of authors, and I understand the process of writing a book, and then you end up in the editing section, and then you come up with new ideas, and then you learn more. So what have you learned since writing the book that's not in there, that's kind of beyond?
You're right. There is this really incredible process. For me, it was getting that first draft. And then I spent about 6 months going through 2 fundamental rewrites of the book. And I heard this going into the process, that what you first write and what you end up with will be totally different. Not totally different, but fundamentally different. And that was so true for me. Like, the book that is now out there in the world is, from a content standpoint, close to what I'd originally written, although there's some adds and significant differences. But the whole notion of program and code was something that just I got through some sort of inspiration, and the way it's constructed is totally different. So that was a really rich and rewarding experience. I don't know if there's a whole lot. I'm actually very fortunate to be sitting here now, almost a couple months after being published, not having any regrets that, boy, I would have loved to have included this, or there's something I just found out and discovered that, wouldn't that be great as an extra chapter? It feels really complete to me. And that doesn't mean that in a year or 2 or 3 from now, there's not more things that I would have loved to have included. And maybe that's the seed of a second book, but I'm very fortunate to feel very complete in what I wrote and what the book contains.
And that's awesome. It's a great feeling to have that you did that. And I think part of the reason maybe why that occurred is because the book not only explains the problem, but it also gives you the step-by-step, which is that allows people to kind of go through and start taking action, which I think a lot of times when the author's first book comes out, it doesn't dig as much into that second part. So let's kind of dig into this. One of the things you said is everyone is running a code, a subconscious program. What does that mean?
Well, so what it means is that from the very first moment we enter the world, we begin to develop subconsciously, we don't know we're doing it, beliefs and values and rules. And those beliefs, values, and rules are safety-based. They're designed to keep us safe and protect us, that begin to aggregate and form what I call a program that automatically drives your behavior and limits your results. Oftentimes serves you, particularly early on. And the program is constructed very early on in childhood. I say in the book that, I was 40 years old when I realized that my life was being run by a program written by a 7-year-old boy. And there's something really profound and almost ludicrous about that notion, but it's true. For most of us, the way we behave and act, the decisions we make, the results that we get, the kind of life we're living is a byproduct of a subconscious program that's being executed, and we aren't even aware of it. And so the basic premise of the book is that is true for every one of us, and that one of the most fundamental steps you can take to leading an extraordinary life is the realization of that. And so I very start of the book is a chapter on awareness, which is just being aware that we have this program and that we have a choice. And I often say the human superpower is the ability to choose the meaning that we give to our circumstances or the beliefs that we hold. So we have this superpower of choice that we don't really know exists, and we haven't discovered it, and we're hardly using it. So the book is about discovering that superpower of choice and then intentionally using it to construct a purposeful code that's really designed to serve you and produce extraordinary results. That's the basic premise.
And, I've heard this thing said, and it reminds me, and it's funny. They say General Motors builds sports cars to sell to 7-year-old boys that they buy when they're in their 40s.
That's right.
And it's the same thing. It's a shame that we're not taught at a very young age because it's my understanding, and many of the books that you quoted in your book, we've talked about on the show before, many of the same authors and the same processes. But all of that coding, for the most part, is done between about 7 and 13.
Yeah.
And to think that we're essentially living that childlike code, we need to start teaching our teenagers that they have the choice to reprogram themselves and constantly reprogram themselves over and over again. So the question I have is, how fast can you reprogram yourself?
Yeah, well, I avoided the temptation of saying, it's just 10 easy steps and, to an extraordinary life. And I explicitly say in the book, this is hard work, and it requires a commitment to be on a path of mastery. This book is really a book about self-mastery. And if you have mastered anything in life or attempted to master anything in life, it's a path that's never ending. That doesn't mean to say that you can't experience transformative results or breakthrough results in how you see yourself, others, in the world very quickly. But it does entail a true lifelong commitment to being the master of yourself. I start the book with a quote by a Stoic philosopher, Epictetus: "No one is free who is not master of himself." And there is this sense of mastery that's weaved throughout the book. And at the same time, the opportunity at whatever age to begin to see yourself in the world in totally different ways, and therefore have a totally different experience of life and get totally different results. So I hold that kind of paradox sort of throughout the book, sort of sits underneath the book, if you will. The other thing I'd say is, I agree with you. Wouldn't it be great if people could learn this at a really early age? And for some people, you have to be ready to take yourself on, and it can happen in your 20s, it can happen in your 30s. It took me 40 years to get to the point where I was really ready, or the time was right to take myself on. And I think it's very individualistic as to when that is. But I agree with you. It's a fundamental power that we have as human beings that we don't know, we're not aware of, we're not told about, we're not taught in schools. And part of the promise of the book is to give people the opportunity to see that.
I begin every morning. As part of my morning routine, I read Epictetus. And as soon as I'm done with the book, I just start over again.
Yeah.
It's just a constant. And every time I'm going through, I'm like, oh, I see. Because it's literally a book on how to reprogram yourself, how to let go, how to overcome your ego and your programming. And it's just, that book is probably 2,000 years old, maybe something like that. And
yes.
It always amazes me. People don't change. We are the same people. The life around us may have changed, but our underlying programming is still the same. And if we don't adapt to a modern world, we're still stuck running that kind of an old program. And I also find that even while reprogramming myself, the old programs still come back. They're still stuck in there, and it's like, wait a minute, I thought we fixed that one, but no, we got to figure out how to defragment the hard drive and remove it completely. So I guess that is where this time and the struggle takes place. Yeah,
and I would say that this notion of removing and fixing, I just advise people to be careful of, because there's an important honoring, and I know you know this and appreciate it. Parts of the code that have reached the limits of their effectiveness, and I think it's important to say it that way. right? That it's not broken, it's not wrong. And so we don't want to demonize or diminish, because all of the parts of our program served an incredibly useful and important purpose. They've just reached their limits of their effectiveness. And so I often say it's not get rid of them, it's expand that part of your program. And that's an important nuance, I think, because as soon as we begin to tell people they've got to get rid of the parts of themselves that actually led to the very success that they've had in life, you get resistance. And so I'm really sincere about, wow, I had this immense need, for financial security, or an incredible need I talk about in the book to be likable, right? So important was it, so compulsive was that belief that it really constrained my effectiveness. I had a very difficult time having direct, honest conversations with people. So it wasn't about getting rid of the desire to be likable, but it was to loosen the attachment to it, so I had more range of freedom. I could be likable when I needed to. I could be very clear and direct, and let go of that need, even though I'm pretty likable when I'm clear and direct. So I oftentimes say the old parts of our program that are no longer truly serving us are always going to be there. They need to be honored, and the opportunity is to expand them, not necessarily get rid of them.
And I really enjoyed that whole section on being direct or being kind, because it's a struggle that I constantly have. And actually, I was talking with a coaching client this morning, same struggle, is that balance. And I really enjoyed the way that you used kindness to be direct, and you got buy-in from the person that you were talking to. I think that's really going to help me as I have those conversations, because I am much more of a direct, straightforward kind of person. And I realize a lot of people don't want direction, I guess. They don't want to change their programming, right? So it was nice how you weave that conversation through. I really appreciated that part of the book.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah. And it does speak to, I touch on the book, this notion of polarity thinking, this notion of that we approach life with either or thinking. We see, problems to be solved. Do I need to be direct, or should I be kind? And we set up these false dichotomies, right? And what I offer in the book is a powerful distinction, the work of Barry Johnson, which is that most of our choices and dilemmas, particularly in this complex world that we live and lead in, are oftentimes not problems to be solved that require either or thinking, but natural, healthy tensions that can be leveraged through a different way of thinking. And so direct and kind is a great one, right? It is not a choice between the two, as we all know intellectually, but that's not what we do. We actually approach it as an either or. And the opportunity to see, how can I integrate the two? How can I get the benefit and the wisdom of being direct and the benefit and the wisdom of being kind without the downsides of over-focusing on either? And imagine yourself as a leader of anything, organization, a family, your relationships, where you can bring the best of being direct, right? It's unfiltered. They're seeing you in an honest way, and the benefits of being kind, and do that in an integrated way. And that exists for everything. That's a distinction that has really changed the way I live and lead my life pretty profoundly.
And I think I talk about that a lot with people. Everyone, as you said, everyone thinks it's a yes or no. And I'm like, no, it's more like the alphabet. It's A to Z, and M is in the middle. And there's a lot of choices in between those two. And you've got to figure out kind of where you fit in and how you want to turn that dial in between the two. But it's not always a yes or no. And I think that gets a lot of people stuck. But when they start to realize that there are a lot more choices that they can take and make, then it gives them a lot more flexibility. And the way that you explain that really showed that with that particular area. Can you share your visit to Folsom Prison and the program they run to drop your armor?
Yeah, incredible experience. I've been just blessed to be part of an organization called Inside Circle that for the last 20 years has been doing incredible work inside Folsom State Prison here in Northern California. It's sort of a famous prison in the maximum security section of the prison. And it started in response to kind of race riots in the yard in C Yard, which is the maximum security part of Folsom, and a group of what were then called and still called shot callers or elders got together from the different racial groups and said, we got to do something to change this. And they began to sit in circle as men and share what they were experiencing in a very authentic, raw way. And a person who was inside Folsom that got out of Folsom, went back to lead a weekly meeting of those men in the chapel. And that has been going on now for, 20 years. And I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, they began to invite men from the outside, men like us, and it is men because it's a male prison, to go inside, not to teach them anything, but to actually learn through a shared process. And so I first went inside Folsom maybe 4 years ago. I've been several times. And I share my experience in the book. My first experience in there, I had no idea what to expect. I had this sort of vague, almost contemptuous notion that there was nothing I needed to really learn. And boy, was I wrong. And I spent the 3 days, and that was the length of the program. And by the way, there's an incredible documentary called The Work that won all sorts of awards, came out around maybe 2 years ago, that I would really encourage people to watch, which is a documentary on one of these 3-day programs. But it was a profound experience for me. And I share in the book that it was in that moment that I had really confronted the narrative that I'd been holding about how my mother abandoned me. And I put that kind of in air quotes, because that was the story I'd been telling myself, that I was a boy abandoned by his mother, neglected, never really having a love of his mother, and holding quite a bit of resentment that I thought I had processed, but I really hadn't. And it was in the presence of two people inside, people both of whom had been convicted for murder. And I say there were two incredible qualities about the men inside. One is incredible patience. And that sort of you can understand. You spend a lot of time inside. You sort of learn to cultivate patience. But the other thing was absolute kindness and understanding. I've never felt more loved in my life than inside that chapel with those men. And they allowed me to process a resentment that I'd been holding, a story I'd been holding about my mother for 40 years, and release it completely. And it's on this I think very powerful chapter on forgiveness and the act of being able to forgive unconditionally and forgive almost to a point where there's nothing ever in the first place to forgive, and all that was left in its place was unadulterated love for my mother. She had passed a couple years before that. And, but I spoke to her in that moment, and I'm just convinced she heard me. And it was an incredibly powerful moment. And that work with those men has taught me a lot about a lot of things. The main thing of which was forgiveness.
And holding resentment causes a lot of problems, and it prevents us from living our extraordinary life. Today's episode of Richer Soul is brought to you by Profit Comes First. Most business owners focus on top-line revenue, and while that's important, the bottom line, what you take home and what's available to reinvest in the business, is what drives continued long-term success. Hundreds of thousands of companies are using Profit First in their business. You don't have to learn fancy accounting systems or how to read complicated financial statements. You just implement the system and behave much like you currently do. However, you pay yourself first. As a certified Profit First professional, I help entrepreneurs and small business owners to grow their business profitably. Through my coaching and consulting, we ensure your business is on track, and I'm making sure that you keep spending in line, increasing your profitability. Learn more at profitcomesfirst.com or click on the scheduling link in the show notes to book a no-obligation call to see how Profit First can help put more money in your pocket. So one of the things that you mentioned, and I think a lot of people always follow this, is you say leaders do not need to change other people. Instead, they should change themselves. And that seems kind of counter to what we're taught. It's leaders are supposed to change people and inspire them to do whatever the leader says.
Yeah, it's one of the most fundamental notions of the book, which is this idea of I'm 100% responsible for my life. And that if I am in a position, and we all are to some degree or another, to influence, inspire, move people, that the most effective way to do that, in fact, I would say the only way to do that effectively and sustainably, is to embody the very things that you're asking other people to do. And, if you look at the great leaders throughout history, Gandhi is one that comes to mind for me all the time. And he's, the famous saying that this isn't quite what he said, but, be the change you want to see in the world. The impact that he had was not through any force or cajoling. It was through an embodiment of a way of living and being that served as an example to move millions and millions of people. And the same thing applies to the leader of an organization or the leader of a family. I say in my book, as a parent, can't expect my children to be polite if I'm not polite. If they don't experience me at a restaurant being polite to the waiter, holding the door open for someone. And I really challenge the leaders that I work with to give up this seductive desire to change others, to ask them to do the very things that you're not fully doing, but to instead really go inward first. And that's why I said this is a book really about self-mastery, and begin to see all the places where you're not doing the things that you're asking others to do, to commit to doing them, to practice doing them, to embody them in such a way that it becomes unnecessary to ask people to do anything, because they are seeing an example of someone living into the kind of values and ways of being that you're trying to promote in your organization. You will begin to move organizations that way. And it's a very significant part of our program. We have this default belief that we have to externalize responsibility, to blame others. And it's a very seductive place to be. I catch myself in that place all the time. So one of the most fundamental parts of the program to rewrite is this notion of 100% responsibility. And I think for me, probably the most important shift that I've experienced.
And it's true. We do have to take complete responsibility for ourselves. I've always said kids don't listen to what you say. They listen to what you do. And so if you want them to behave a certain way, you've got to do it that way. Otherwise, they're not going to listen to you. And the same thing happens in corporate structure as well.
Yeah. And I would say just another little nuance, I think all these nuances are so important, is if all you're doing is doing what you're doing so that others actually change, you've missed the point, right? So it has to come out of a genuine desire to be committed yourself, not in the hopes that somebody does something if I do this. Once it becomes conditional and reciprocal, it loses its power. And so the reality is we cannot change people. I can't force anybody to do anything. I got to give up my attachment to other people getting things, because I will be disappointed and ineffective in life. But what I can do is control who I am, how I show up. My experience has been when I've been in 2 CEO roles, that doing that without expectation and attachment to others following me has been incredibly powerful. Many people follow that example. Many people get inspired. The word inspire comes from the Latin word to breathe air into, breathe life into. Many people get, life and air breathed into them by that example. Some don't. That's always going to be the case. And so people will know the difference, even subconsciously, between a leader who is genuinely embodying a set of values and ways of being because he or she thinks that's the right thing to do for an organization, and one that's doing it for some result so that others change. And that's just an important distinction that I often introduce and throw out.
And thank you for sharing that. I think that is an important distinction, and people have to do it for the right reasons. And again, it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning with uncertainty. You can't predict the outcome. You can only do what you do, and the outcome will come when it comes. And it may not be what you want. So in order to go about doing these things, one of the things that we don't do enough of, I think, is listening. Mm-hmm. And you talk about that a little bit in the book, and I think you use the word default listening. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah. So we do a lot of listening, or at least we think we do. But we do a lot of communicating. And part of communicating, of course, is listening. And I assert that we bring a default listening to every conversation we have. And it's a default listening. If you go to a presentation, you might go to that presentation. Subconsciously, you have a belief about that presentation. It may be something like, I already know this stuff, or there's nothing new that I'm going to learn, or how do I get out of here, right? Or how do I multitask? Whatever it is, there is a default listening that you're bringing that constrains and shapes the quality of your. And so what I'm encouraging the readers of the book to do, and the leaders that I work with, is to know what that default listening is and ask, does it serve you? So, you and I are listening to each other right now, and we have a default listening, right? I might have a listening that says, gosh, I've been on some other podcasts. I wonder if this question is that kind of question. And that is going to constrain and shape the information that I'm hearing and the way I respond, right? So what I then offer is a contrast, and it says, look, total, complete listening, right? Which removes the filters that I unconsciously or subconsciously apply to my listening, and gives you, the person that I'm speaking with, the one that I'm in relationship, the gift of my entire listening, my full and complete listening, where I let go of any regard to myself and to my ego. And the quality of the relationships you build when you're listening that way, and the data, if we want to get really practical, the data that I have access to when I listen in that way, and therefore the quality of the decisions I can make and the results that I can get massively go up. And it's one of these things where we all talk about active listening, and but it's a very, very difficult skill to cultivate, because there is a real need to be distracted. And I get into a little bit of the science of why that is. So it's an overcoming of a lot of conditioning that we have, which is to really listen more with the regard to what is the impact going to be on me, than it is to listen truly to what the speaker is saying, and then to practice that and to just test it out for yourself. And the experience I've had is pretty profound.
And it's very true. We all have a lens, right? We all look at the world through our particular lens. And so when we're hearing people, as you said, we're filtering it through that lens. So the listening is more than just hearing the words and being there in that sense completely. It's also challenging your lens of what you're hearing. That's not so easy to do, is it?
It's not. And it's particularly not easy if you don't know the lens you're bringing in, right? So I think the first step, and maybe the most essential step, is just to say, what is this default listening that I have for this person or this situation? And how might it affect the quality of my listening and what I get out and what I'm able to give? And those two questions are a game changer. Just that alone. You don't have to do much more than that, than to be aware of what you're bringing into the conversation and what impact it might have. The mind will take care of everything else. The quality of your listening and the quality of the relationship and the quality of the experience you have and that person has with you goes dramatically up. So if that's all your listeners were to do, if they were interested in practicing this, is to do that and ask those kind of two basic questions, you'd get a lot out of it.
And that kind of reminds me of the story of two little fish swimming, and the big fish comes by and says, "How's the water?" And the two little fish go, "What's water?" It's awareness, right? And I think that very much applies to the situation of, you've got to be aware that you have a lens, and then you've got to start questioning your own lens, which comes back to what you said before about leadership, right? It's changing ourselves and the way we view things. And I think I've heard it said many times before, events are not good or bad. It's our perception of them that make them good or bad.
Totally. Yeah. And that's what I meant to talk about. This human superpower is the ability to choose the meaning we give to our circumstances. Circumstances are circumstances. You can have two different people confront the very same set of circumstances and apply a totally different meaning. And therefore, the circumstances for them change. It's like they're living in two different worlds. And the actions that they even see as available to take are different. And certainly the results they get. And so life really does show up as a series of opportunities to choose the meaning we give to our circumstances. I give a quote in the book by Viktor Frankl. For your listeners who don't know who Viktor Frankl is, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he was a prisoner in an Auschwitz concentration camp, and that's some of the most unimaginable circumstances. But he realized in that moment that he had the power to choose the meaning he gave to those circumstances. And therein lies the freedom. And he gave them a hopeful and positive meaning, which is almost crazy, right? But it allowed him to thrive and survive and give back to the world an incredible body of work. But it was that choice that he realized he had and made that made all the difference.
And I've kind of started to do that in little parts of my life. Like I now embrace rainy days because I realize we need rain to get the grass to grow and for the flowers to do. And so I'm like, today's the day for rain and it's okay. And it happens in every area of life. You find the small things. And I think that's also the thing is you start by making small changes and then those small changes compound over time to make much bigger changes in life.
Yeah, you talked about a morning ritual. And I often say the first choice we have is the choice of the meaning we give to when we wake up. And I have a practice that the first thought I have when I wake up is to say, I'm lucky to be alive. This is going to be an amazing day. Right now I have a choice. I could say, oh my God, I'm tired. I should have slept more. Right. Oh, I'm dreading, what I've got to do when I get to work or the meeting I'm going to have. Like those are all choices. And so, the first choice we make is that very first choice when we become conscious. Because, waking up is an act of consciousness. And one of the practices I really encourage people to do is get conscious about the choice you're making, about the meaning you're giving your life and your day when you get up in the morning. It can be whatever it is, but you have the responsibility for making that choice and the outcome of it.
And so I think I'm going to read a paragraph out of the book because I think it applies to this. And then I'd love to hear your feedback.
Okay.
The strongest driver of human behavior is the desire to be consistent with one's identity. You will do everything in your power to act in ways that fit with the subconscious beliefs you have about yourself. Your identity is the primary paradigm that shapes and constrains your actions. Are you starting to see the connection here? If you want extraordinary results in life, you have to take actions that will lead to those results. But the actions that are required for an extraordinary life are most likely inconsistent with your current subconscious identity.
Yeah. I love that part of the book, the chapter 7. I'm glad you chose it. It's such an important part of your program. And what I assert in the book is that we all have identities. And we talked a little bit about this already, right? We grow up constructing beliefs about ourselves that aggregate and calcify over time. It's the, math teacher who says, Johnny, you're not a good math student. And Johnny begins to form a belief, I'm not a good math student, and then begins to seek out data to confirm that belief. So we end up constructing an identity, these thousands of beliefs about ourselves that form this collective identity of who we believe we are and what we're capable of. But it's subconscious. We don't realize it's there. I often ask the question to people that I work with and clients is, what's your identity? And they look at me like I have two heads. They've never really been asked that question or thought about it. But if you take the notion and if you believe this, which I think it's been borne out in my experience, that are the greatest driver of behavior is the desire to be consistent with my identity, then I'm going to do everything I can to be consistent with this subconscious identity. And if I'm holding an identity that isn't going to lead to the kind of actions that lead to the type of results that I want, I've got a choice, which is to reconstruct my identity, because every belief, including the beliefs we hold about ourselves, are constructed, and what is constructed can be reconstructed. And I tell the example of myself writing the book, which I alluded to earlier, which is I had a subconscious belief that I was not an author. Now, anybody who has a belief that I am not an author will talk a lot about writing a book, but will never write a book. And it wasn't until I was clued in to that belief, even knowing about identity, said, wait a second, if I want to write a book, I have to embody the identity of an author. I have to declare with certainty and conviction that I am an author. Even though that's not true, I have to wire it into my subconscious. And when I began to really practice that, I'm an author. And I spoke to people about it. Oh, what do you do? I'm this, and I'm an author. I hadn't written a book yet. And I began to tell my subconscious mind, you better start believing me. I'm an author. And the actions that I took were the natural manifestation of that identity. I sat down to write every week. And the book that we're talking about right now is a product of that reconstructed identity. And so one of the most important things we can do in life is to get conscious of the identity that we hold and to reconstruct it in a way that will lead to the kinds of actions and the results we want. And I say in the book is I have an identity. I say it. It's the first thing I say after that belief in the morning. My morning ritual is to say my identity. And I say my identity multiple times throughout the day. I like to scream it in the car. So you really get it wired and embodied in. And it's a very, very powerful practice to have.
And essentially, by doing that, you're reprogramming your subconscious.
Yes, I am reprogramming my subconscious, and it's amazing to see. You know, I've seen the work that I do with clients, that how we start to show up in the world, in our relationships, in our work, in the actions we take, in the way we're being, the way people experience us begins to shift. When you shift your identity, those things shift automatically without effort.
So let's talk about that, because this causes trouble. When you start to shift who you are, you sometimes get a lot of friction from people around you. Like, who do you think you are? Who do you think you're becoming? There's a lot of their ego kind of pushing onto you. Did you ever experience that, or was it not a factor as you were shifting?
There's a little bit of like, wow, you're evolving and growing over the last 10 years. But I would say this is another important distinction. It's vital. And I use the word congruence. So, there has to be, for people to, and it's not like we're doing it so people react favorably, right? I think that's not the main driver, but people will experience us in a positive way when they see real congruence between what we're saying, what we're believing, how we're holding our body. As soon as there's incongruence, like, this guy's, or gal's saying something, but I don't really, there's something off here, right? That's an incongruent. It's not somebody who's truly embodying. And so a lot of my work was to be, how do I get really genuine? And how do I embody it in a way that feels really congruent, really authentic? When you do that, right? When I said I'm an author, it didn't come from a place of arrogance or pretense or pretend. It came from this genuine desire to do something really good in the world, and a humble acknowledgement that I had a gift to offer, and a true commitment and the discipline that came with that commitment. People could see it. It was written all over my face. It was written, it was everything that I spoke, how I held myself, the smile that when I was lit up by talking about writing this book, there was absolute congruence. And so the only way human beings can react to that is positively. So I always just caution people, this isn't about just saying something and then hoping it happens. It's about a commitment to embodying it completely and doing it in a way that feels really authentic. And when you do that and show up in that way, that's a really attractive way of being. And so I didn't experience a lot of that because I was attuned to the importance of, doing it for the right reason and embodying it and doing it with a level of humility and kindness and sensitivity that takes a little bit of time to cultivate, but I think has the right kind of intended impact.
And that must be what you meant by use your body to control your brain's default response, enhance your move, and improve decision making. So it's not just our words, it's the way our body also portrays what we're doing, because 90% of communication is nonverbal.
Totally. And, and that it ties to this idea of like, how do we choose to give meaning to our circumstances? One of the ways we give meaning to our circumstances is our body. Our body drives our emotional and energetic state, and our emotional and energetic state is going to determine the meaning that you give to your body, to your circumstances. If I wake up with a big smile on my face, which I do, and I have my body open, I'm stretching, I'm embracing the day, right? The likelihood that I'll be in the right emotional and energetic state to truly and congruently believe this is going to be a phenomenal day, even though I've got a tough schedule and whatever it is, and I'm going to have a tough conversation, whatever the reality is out there. If I hold my body in a certain way, right, with my facial expressions, my breathing, my posture, the openness of my body, the likelihood that I'm able to authentically and congruently give an empowering and positive meaning to the outlook of my day goes way up. So we underestimate the importance of our physiology. And I oftentimes ask leaders, I said, how many of you walked into this room today? It's an important, call it a 2-day offsite, and ask the question, how am I going to optimize my physiology so that I increase my performance and the performance of others around me? And no one will ever raise their hand because it's just not a question we ask ourselves. But it is one of the most underutilized and underleveraged assets we have as leaders and as human beings, as parents, as friends, as partners in relationships, is the way we intentionally use our bodies so that we're in an optimal emotional and energetic state, so that we are able to congruently give kind of positive and empowering meaning to our circumstances. And that's a game changer.
I think one of the people that I've observed doing this and watching this who does a phenomenal job at it is Tony Robbins.
Yeah.
He literally watches. He's got the gift of watching for micro expressions and the entire body language. Like, he doesn't even need to hear the words. He can look at the body and know exactly what's kind of going on. And it's fun to watch him actually do that. And there's plenty of videos out there that you can catch of him doing it.
He's masterful. And if you haven't had the experience of learning from him, I would highly, highly recommend it. And he has been a teacher of mine and has influenced my understanding of and appreciation of physiology and state as such an important component in the variable of life. So I give him a lot of credit for that body of wisdom that again, all of these bodies of wisdom have been around for thousands of years. It's about how do we tap into them and relate them to people in the modern world. And I think he's done an extraordinary job of doing that.
He does. He can get an audience going for 4 days straight, 12 hours a day, and you don't feel tired. So he's mastered that. It was a fun experience. So what would you say is the most important factor in being successful in life?
I'd probably go back to this notion of responsibility. And we have a choice about not only what we believe about ourselves, but a choice about what we believe about our circumstances. And there's a choice. There's sort of two ends of that spectrum. One is what I call victim mindset. I can hold the belief that there's nothing I can do to affect my circumstances. Circumstances shape me. Or I can hold a responsible mindset, a belief that there's always something I can do to affect my circumstances. I shape my circumstances. I'm 100% responsible for my life. And what I say is that is a fundamental choice. What I say is if you operate from a responsible mindset, it's not that that's necessarily true, because there's always going to be things that are out of our control. It's a stand to take. And I often say it's not about the truth. It's about which belief better serves you. And in my experience, the belief that there's always something I can do to affect my circumstances, I'm 100% responsible in my life, will always be the more empowering, more effective belief. And there's a body of 50 years of research on this psychological concept, which is close to responsible mindset, called locus of control, which has shown study after study after study that effectiveness in life in every dimension, relationships, health, education, career, finances, leadership, goes massively way up when we come from the orientation of I control and affect my circumstances. That is a power I have. And that's the first question that I ask. What could I do or could I have done to make this a better outcome? Is a inherent recognition of my power to shape my circumstances. And what will happen from that orientation is a whole new set of actions appear that weren't even available for you to see. And out of that action set, the probability of getting better results in whatever you're doing go way up. So that's the one I would point to is maybe the most important single driver.
We are responsible for ourselves. No one else is responsible for our outcomes. We have to make those choices. There are people who are in difficult situations, paraplegics, people who face cancer, who have all kinds of things, and they take responsibility. They change their mindset. They have the ability to use that for much greater good. So one of the favorite parts of my book was towards the end, and it's this whole concept, this Japanese word of ikigai. It's the reason for living. It's the combination of what you love, what you are good at, with what the world needs and what you can be paid for. And I know a lot of people talk about passion, and passion seems to be the combination of what you love and are good at. The problem with passion is the world may not pay you for it. And if you're okay with that, that's fine. You can have parts of your life. I just really enjoyed the way that kind of brought it all together. So could you expound a little bit on that concept?
Yeah, I love it. Was one of my favorite discoveries. Ikigai is a Japanese word for the reason for getting out of bed in the morning. And what I love about it, and the four things that you pointed to, what I'm good at, what the world needs, what I love to do, and what I can get paid for, in whatever way you define getting paid for, right? It can mean extraordinary financial success or moderate. But it's sort of what the world values as well, is just such a comprehensive way of answering the question that I often get asked, and I address in the last chapter of the book, is like, what is my purpose in life? And that is a nice guide. And I also say, like, don't be in a rush to figure that out. The more you're in a rush, the harder it's going to be to see it. So I do counsel a lot of patience, because some people will figure that out. My daughter figured that out, before she was a teenager. She's now studying musical theater and wants to go to Broadway, and has known her calling and her passion for as long as we can remember. And I think we did a really good job of seeing it and cultivating it. But her hard work, it took me 40 years to really figure out, what is it that I'm really good at? What do I love to do? What does the world really need? Not what I think they need, but what does the world really need? And what can I get paid for, right? Because we do live in a world where we need to provide some level of financial security, however we want to define that. And there's a wide range of definition there for sure. So it will show up when it's supposed to, and if you're attuned to it and listening for it and watching for it. So I think with purpose and calling, the fundamental advice is be attuned to it, look for it. And when you see it, it'll be unmistakable. And it may take some time.
It does. It took me till this year to figure it out for me. And then when I read that, I'm like, oh, I figured this out. That's what you call that. Now I know. And it is finally kind of all come together. And I'm in my 50s. So as you said, and think in the book, they even talk about it being 70s, 80s, 90s. So you never know when it comes. And my wife was like your daughter. She knew what she wanted to do when she was like 5. God bless them. The rest of us, We got to struggle and figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I always like to ask, based on our conversation, what's one action step people can take this week to move forward?
I like to talk about the importance of daily rituals, which we've talked about a little bit. And I've written about this, and I call it the 10 minutes that can change your life. And I say that, the biggest pushback I get when I counsel and coach people to adopt a daily ritual, because I think the act of doing something daily without exception is the act of an extraordinary life and an extraordinary person. But the pushback I often get is, I don't have enough time. And it's a legitimate one, right? We live in a crazy world and our schedules are jam-packed. But I say, then wake up 10 minutes earlier than you otherwise would have. So if you're waking up at 6:15, get up at 6:05. And it's hard to argue with that, right? And that's the practice I do, which is I get up 10 minutes earlier than I otherwise would need to. And I use that space to do a number of things. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. Again, it's that practice of just getting up every morning and doing something that's devoted to your self-mastery that will be in and of itself transformative, because you will now have an identity of somebody who gets up every day without exception. And I like to tell very briefly that the quick story of Jerry Seinfeld, who said early in his career, I'm going to write a new joke every single day. It doesn't matter whether it's a good joke or it's a bad joke, but I'm going to do it every day, and I'm never going to break the chain, meaning I'm never going to miss a day. And so what you can do, your listeners can do right now, is to say, and particularly with the new year coming up, everybody's interested in New Year's resolutions, is I'm going to get up 10 minutes every day. And I'm going to do that for 30 days. I always like to time-bound experiments. Otherwise, people end up, it's just too much, right? To say or I'm going to do it for a week, whatever that time-bounding is for you. But I'm going to do that, and I'm going to decide what I do in those 10 minutes. For me, it's a gratitude practice, and I do a loving kindness meditation. I say my identity statement, and I pick the 3 things that I'm really focused on accomplishing in that day ahead. Sort of a visualization exercise. For me, that's what I do. And it can be whatever it is for you, but it's the act of doing it every day without exception for 10 minutes.
If you don't have 10 minutes in your day, we got a lot bigger problems to work on. Exactly. I mean, seriously.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Tony Robbins. He said, if you don't have 10 minutes, you don't have a life.
Exactly.
It's very true.
And I tell people, your morning routine begins the night before. So Fix your night. It will fix your morning. My morning routine tends to run almost 2 hours, but that includes going and exercising, my shower, all the other things. But on most days, it's a good 2 hours before I start kind of getting into the flow of things. It's just me prepping for my day. And then I can just crank through stuff once that's done.
Totally.
It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Self-mastery. It's the notion that working on myself and understanding myself and mastering myself is a lifelong journey that I'm committed to.
And it is a lifelong journey. You never kind of achieve it, right? There's always that next step, and you just have to enjoy the journey and just keep going.
Exactly.
What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Probably the power of identity, which we've talked about, and how important it is to understand that I hold beliefs about myself that in some ways really serve me and in some ways really limit me, and that I have a choice to reconstruct that identity. That's probably been the later in life learning that's had the most impact on me.
And I think a lot of times we're blind to that. And so sometimes going and asking other people, to tell you your identity, because we use a lot of words that we probably don't realize we're using. And when somebody watches you and looks at the words you say, they pick them out and you're like, wow, I didn't even realize I was doing that. A lot of times we're just oblivious to it. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
One specific piece of wisdom. Well, I would say the notion of, this notion of being responsible and that you have a choice. But if I were to add to something, because I know we've already covered that, it would be to read and read all the time. That life is an opportunity to learn and grow. and you're going to have a ton of choices about how you use your time, but use it to enrich your mind.
And I love reading. My goal was 2 books a month. In the last 2 months, I've been at 7 books a month.
Wow.
Well, part of it is because I have all these guests coming on, and so I've got to read their books. So that kind of that puts the pressure to even jump it further on. And
nice.
It's been a lot of fun. I'm just amazed that the quality of the books keeps going higher, and then I think my understanding of the subject matter keeps going deeper. And so, you spend a lot of time in writing your book, and there is just so much of wisdom put into books that has taken people a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years and a lifetime of experience. It's silly not to spend a little bit of money and to spend a little time just figuring that out. It's an immense resource.
Yeah, agreed.
If people would like to find you and connect, what is the best way for them to do that?
I have a website, darrenjgold.com, DARRENJGOLD, and you can find more about me and resources on there. My firm, the Trium Group, TRIUMGROUP.com, is a great resource. And then, of course, I'd love you to read the book. It's available on Amazon, hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and audiobook, and I narrate the audiobook. So that's available, and you can find it on Amazon.
And I encourage people to read the book. It's been one of the best that I've read this year. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Rocky, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
I really enjoyed the book, which goes into far more depth. And I also enjoyed this conversation with Darren. If you want to attend a Tony Robbins event, I highly encourage it. I do have an affiliate link on my website under affiliates. It's an amazing experience. I want to cover some principles from the book that we didn't dig into, but it's basically the difference between how an average person is run by programs and how an extraordinary person who masters his or her code runs a different program. So the average person says, I am who I am. Extraordinary, I am the author of my life. Average, I'm hardwired to react. Extraordinary, I act, I don't react. Ordinary, I avoid risk and do whatever it takes to stay safe. Extraordinary, I play to win. Ordinary, I avoid responsibility whenever I can. Extraordinary, I am 100% responsible for my life. Ordinary, I hold on to grudges. Extraordinary, I forgive unconditionally. Ordinary, I need to be right. Extraordinary, I seek to understand. Ordinary, I don't challenge the status quo. Extraordinary, I own my identity. Ordinary, I have limited potential. Extraordinary, I never stop learning and growing. Ordinary, I don't keep my commitments. Extraordinary, I am my word. Ordinary, I don't control my destiny. Extraordinary, I live on purpose. Which code would you rather be running? As for me, I prefer extraordinary. I actually cut this out of the book. It sits on my desk, and so I can constantly remind myself who I want to be and the codes that I want to run. I really enjoyed the concept of Ikigai and have been continuing to work on that theme in my life. You'll be hearing more on this topic over time. This week's action step was to start a daily ritual. I have lots of them. They're all designed to put me in peak state and focus every day. I encourage you to start one, even a tiny one, something small. It could be something as simple as when you wake up, you thank the universe for the items we take for granted every day that so many people don't have. Or maybe you can start a new one of sharing an episode of Richer Soul with a few friends. It can start a great conversation, and I'd appreciate that ritual. I'd love to connect with you on the Facebook page or in the Facebook group for Richer Soul. Please stop by and say hi. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve. Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Can I help you achieve your goals through coaching and accountability? Just email me. We can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit for coaching. For many people, one session allows them to take a giant leap forward towards their dreams. You can get me at rocky@richersoul.com, or there's a scheduling link in the show notes. I'd love to hear how you're doing and how the information I've shared has helped. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week and an abundant year.